On this day, we commemorate disaster. And it's a disaster that the Book of Lamentation helps us to experience once again in gory detail every year. Every year, we read about mothers cooking their beloved children, about people dying in the street, about the city of Jerusalem crying alone while all its lovers scorn her. And every year, we're given the opportunity to experience again the magnitude, the visceral nature of this disaster. The truth is that this disaster that took place in a particular moment in history, in a particular time, in a particular place, was only the opening shot in a long road of trouble, in a long road of suffering, the road of exile. And this is a road that we have many intimate memories from, many intimate memories, much more than can be contained in one book, comprehensive though the Book of Lamentations is, much more than can be confined into one historical moment. It's a road that includes the Holocaust. It's a road that includes the Spanish Inquisition. It's a road that includes the moment of joy when the Jews came into Poland and were welcomed to it, only to then be killed in one pogrom after another and bled dry, both physically, monetarily, and spiritually by people who hated them. It's a road that led us to some very bad places, but also to some hospitable places. And yet it always left us with the knowledge that we were reliant on some level on the kindness of strangers, and that we will always come face to face with people who hate us. It's a road that led me personally all the way back to Jerusalem, but a Jerusalem that isn't redeemed, a Jerusalem where the temple doesn't stand and the covenant with God is not clear and obvious for all to see. It's a road that opened up millennia ago and has never closed since then. And this is the road I want to talk with you about today. Not so much the moment of destruction itself, but rather what it brought into our life as a nation, and that is a state of exile. We know, because the stages teach us that this exile that we experience now, the longest exile in our history, started because of baseless hatred, and will end when we learn to absorb or when we learn to adopt baseless love. The problem, of course, with these words is that they're very vague. They're very general. What does it even mean? What does it mean to have baseless hatred chase us out of our land? Why should it do that? And what does it mean for us to find within us baseless love? And how should that lead us away from exile and into an era of redemption? What about it will achieve this long coveted goal of the Jewish people? What about it will be the answer to the prayer that may we be in built Jerusalem next year that we sing at the end of both Yom Kippur and Pesach? To answer this question, or at least to try and supply an answer to this question, I don't think there's any one comprehensive answer that can fully answer everything we have to ask. I want to suggest that we look at the first great exile our people experienced as such, the exile of Egypt, Galut Mitzrayim. That exile too started from a moment of hatred and ended in a moment of love. And in both cases, the hatred in the one case, and respectively, the love in the other case, was the hatred or love that exists between brothers. The hatred was the hatred that Joseph's brothers felt towards him, a hatred that led them to sell him into slavery, and eventually meant that when they found him, they moved there, thus starting the process of exile from the land of Canaan, the promised land later. And the act of love, the love between brothers that marked the turning point, the moment where that exile could finally come into a close, where we could finally leave it behind and start on the path towards return and redemption, was the love between two brothers who grew up in very, very different worlds, under very different circumstances, pursuing different occupations, Aaron and Moshe. Let's see it in the sources. When God tries to get Moshe to agree to go and get the people out of Egypt, Moshe raises a long series of objections. He says, I am the wrong person for the job. He says, I am not a good speaker. He says, the people will not listen to me. He says, Paro will not listen to me. And God keeps explaining and giving him signs and giving him instructions. And at some point, God loses his patience. Let's look at that point. We're in Exodus 4, verse 13. But he said, please, O Lord, make someone else your agent. The Lord became angry with Moses, and he said, there is your brother Aaron the Levite. He, I know, speaks readily. Even now he is setting out to meet you, and he will be happy to see you. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth. I will be with you and with him as you speak, and tell both of you what to do. And he shall speak for you to the people. Thus he shall serve as your spokesman, with you playing the role of God to him. Now, you may well look at this short passage and say, Rachel, what are you talking about? This is not a moment of love between brothers. This is just a strategic need. Moshe is fearful that he's not going to be able to communicate with the people effectively, which, let's be honest, is a very valid concern, seeing as he grew up in the palace, removed from their suffering, removed from their oppression, removed from the horrors they had to live through. Why would they listen to him? Why would they feel like he is someone they can trust? So God says, okay, here's a strategic solution. I will give you your brother who did live with the people, who did suffer with the people, and he will serve as the bridge between you and them and allow you to take them out of Egypt. Now, I would agree with you if you were to say that, if it wasn't for one small yet significant detail that hides here in verse 14. The English translation says, he will be happy to see you. But what it says in the Hebrew is more than that. It says, V'ra'acha, and he shall see you, V'samach, and he shall be happy, in his heart. In his heart. Aaron is not merely going to be saying all the right things. He's going to feel them. He's going to feel a certain joy in seeing Moshe. The Midrash Tanchuma on this verse emphasizes that this rejoicing of Aaron's is not to be taken for granted. Because in a sense, when Moshe comes to Egypt and says, God sent me to take you out of here, he is replacing or displacing Aaron from his position amongst the people. According to the sages, Aaron was a prophet in the land of Egypt, and he gave the people prophecies of comfort, and he helped them withstand the suffering for all the years of horror they had to endure. And here comes his brother, the one who grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth in the palace, and says, now I will lead the people and comfort them and take them out of here. We wouldn't be surprised if Aaron was to resent it, especially since Moshe is a younger brother. After all, throughout the book of Genesis, we saw brothers resent each other on similar grounds. Joseph's brother, just as a reminder, in the moment that started the exile in Egypt, resented him because their father loved him best. Let's look together in Genesis 37. I'm going to start here in verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph best of all his sons, for he was the child of his old age, and he had made him an ornamented tunic. And here comes the horrible response. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of his brothers, they hated him so that they could not speak a friendly word to him. This moment echoes the earliest story of siblings we have in the entire Tanakh, in the entire Hebrew Bible, namely the story of Cain and Abel. There too, the older brother sees a person of authority, some source of authority, in this case God, favoring or appearing to favor his younger brother, and responds with resentment. Let's look at that too. I'm in box 4 in the source sheet. And I'm going to jump straight to verse 3. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the soil, and Abel, for his part, brought the choicest of firstlings in his flock. The Lord paid heed to Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering he paid no heed. Cain was much distressed, and his face fell. So we see it with Cain, we see it with Joseph's brother, yet when we finally encounter Moshe and Aaron, we see an older brother who, when his younger brother comes and says, God gave me a mission, not you, me, the younger brother, and I am going to lead the people now, responds not with resentment, but rather with joy that isn't merely a pro forma declaration of joy, but rather, we are told specifically, a joy that he truly and honestly felt in his heart. The Rav Soloveitchik, paid a lot of attention to this detail. And following Midrash Tanchuma, that makes a point to point out to us that Moshe and Aaron here break a certain pattern that was established in this brotherhood stories in the book of Genesis by having this joy in their encounter and by being willing to rejoice in each other's successes. And by the way, the sages in Midrash Tanchuma point out that this continues throughout their lives. When Aaron receives the priesthood, Moshe is happy for him. Just as when Moshe became the leader, Aaron was happy for him. Anyway, Rav Soloveitchik, following this tradition in the Midrash, says that not only is this an important, how shall I put it, an important emotional moment in the story, but the exile couldn't have ended without it. Because the exile started when brothers hated each other in their hearts, it must end when brothers rejoice or accept or love each other, feel positive feelings toward each other in their heart. But why is that the case? Other than the fact that there's a certain satisfying feeling when a story begins and ends like that, when there's something that bookends the story, a failure of a particular type here, and then a moment where the hero or heroes rise to the challenge and correct that original failure at the end. Other than the fact that it's stylistically pleasing to us when we listen to a story, why is it important to end the exile of Egypt in the same way that it started, or in the opposite, the mirror way that it started? Now, one answer could be that the Tanakh, the Torah, is teaching us an important lesson about teshuvah here. Soon it's going to be Elul. We're going to be talking about what teshuvah means. And already here we see the seeds of it, because there's a famous concept about teshuvah, about return, about repentance, that its truest form, its truest manifestation happens when someone is faced with the same challenge, same temptation that he or she failed to rise to in the past and handles it correctly. So when we see two brothers faced with what in previous cases, from Cain all the way to Joseph and his brothers, led to the dissolution of brotherly feelings, yet in their case leads to working together as partners in one endeavor, we can say that somehow the soul of the Jewish people did teshuvah, that somehow the soul of the Jewish people restored itself to what it should be, and they can go back to the land of Israel. I want to suggest a slightly different approach, a slightly different angle on the same question. If we think about it, what we see here, when we think about it for a second, or not for a second, if we take a step back and look again at the story of Joseph and his brother and Moshe and Aaron as being part of an older pattern that started with Cain and Abel, continued with Ishmael and Yitzchak, then with Jacob and Esau, and only eventually with Jacob's children, Joseph and his brother, we can see that the connection between brotherhood and exile goes deep. It's not only in this particular story, the story of our galut in Egypt, our exile in Egypt and its dissolution, that brotherhood plays a role. Almost every story of brotherhood, of siblinghood, in the book of Genesis ends in exile. When Cain kills Abel after resenting the fact that God accepted Abel's offering and not his own, his punishment is exile. Let's look at it together. I am again in source 4. In verse 11, therefore you shall be more cursed than the ground which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. If you till the soil, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. You shall become a ceaseless wanderer on earth. Somehow, by killing his brother, Cain, the man who made his living from the ground and then put his brother's body in it, can no longer be rooted anywhere. He is not merely exiled from one place. He becomes the exile par excellence, the ultimate exile, who can never belong anywhere, who ceaselessly wanders the earth. Later, when there's tension between Yitzchak's place in Abraham's house and Ishmael's place in Abraham's house, Sarah insists that Ishmael and his mother Agar will be exiled from the house. Later still, when Yitzchak's own sons feud, when Jacob steals the blessings by disguising himself as Esau wants to kill him, and Rebekah encourages Jacob to go into exile in her motherland, in Haran, to run away from his brother's murderous rage. When Joseph is sold into Egypt, this is not the first iteration of exile. This is the fourth case of a household where the gates of exile open up, where one brother is lost, is kicked out, is taken away from the household due to the dissolution of brotherly relationships between the siblings. If we think about it, there's something very natural. Because what does it mean when brothers fight? When brothers fight, what it means is that somebody will no longer have a place in the childhood home. Somebody will leave. Somebody will be an outcast. Somebody will be an exile. But the truth is that it's more than that. What does it mean to be brothers? What does it mean to share childhood experiences? In a way, it means that on some deep level, we share the same story. We belong to the same roots in our own narrative of who we are. And when brothers fight, they no longer share this feeling of being part of one story. We see it often around us when family disputes explode and people start arguing backwards, not merely about whatever stands between them at the moment in their present, but rather about childhood events, childhood memories, the significance or the meaning of certain moments in their shared memory. And we can see how each sibling forms a separate story where the same events from childhood mean totally different things. And in a sense, how can you not see that as leading to an exile of the soul? Because what it means is that we can no longer belong to the same shared memory, to the same shared stories. Regardless of the physical home or the physical homeland, when brothers fight, they can no longer look back and say, remember this? Yes, I remember this, and feel that shared belonging in their hearts. Perhaps this is why it's so important to emphasize that Aaron is happy in his heart, not merely to show that he's genuine, not merely to show that this pair of brothers will correct the mistake of the previous sets of brothers we saw in Genesis, most recently Joseph and his brothers, but rather to also tell us that the healing can't start from pro forma actions. It can't start from strategic operations. It has to start not in a place, but rather in a shared story that both people can find within themselves the feeling of belonging to. There's an interesting midrash that says that when God spoke to Moshe and told him, go to Egypt and Aaron will meet you there. And when God spoke to Aaron and told him, your brother Moshe is coming to Egypt, go ahead and meet him. God didn't make two separate utterances in those two cases, but rather God made one utterance that somehow split itself into two messages, one for Moshe and one for Aaron. It's here in Shmot Rabbah 5:9, but I'm going to start here in the bold text. At the time that the Holy One, blessed be He, said to Moshe in Midian, go return to Egypt, the speech divided into two voices, and it became two faces. And Moshe heard in Midian, and go return to Egypt, but Aaron heard, go to meet Moshe in the wilderness. Hence, God thunders wonders with his voice. Perhaps this midrash is catching on to the necessity for unity between Moshe and Aaron. Not simply unity in action, but also unity in experience in their heart. Unity in the sense that they see themselves as part of the same mission, as a condition or a foundation upon which the return from the physical exile can take place. In other words, before the Hebrew slaves can find one place, the promised land, where they can be rooted and not exiles, where they can be sovereign, where they can belong, they need to find a way to belong to one another. This is more than a mystical, poetical sentiment, as we see in the events that follow upon the Hebrews' return to the land of Israel. Specifically in the era of the Judges, after Joshua, the great leader who helped them cross the Jordan and started them on their war of conquest, passes on. Because what happens in the era of the Judges is that the Hebrews are in their land. They're in the place where they're not supposed to be exiles anymore. They're rooted. They have a place in the world, but they don't see each other as connected, and they fall apart into these disparate tribes, each of them fighting their own wars against the nations around them, each of them busy with their own occupations, not helping the others when they're in need. And what happens is that when they're in this disparate state, disconnected from each other, disconnected from their unifying past, they don't have the power to establish a powerful government. They don't have the power to establish an era of peace that will allow them to flourish. Instead, they're constantly busy in their many, many wars of survival, sometimes even fighting against one another instead of just against other nations in the area. And they can't cohere or coalesce into one powerful nation in its own right. So even though the physical exile is gone, sovereignty, independence, the ability to design your own future eludes them. Only when First Samuel, then King Saul, and then King David really unite them into one group can they establish the lasting identity of Israel, the people of Israel, that will allow them to build a civilization and not merely to survive. In other words, only when they find themselves in one another, when they can see themselves as belonging to one story, can the story continue and be a story of success. And only then can they build the temple on the Temple Mount and come to worship God in his home. Let's recoup and see where we're going here. Time after time after time, pairs of siblings in the book of Genesis see each other and feel rejection. They see something they dislike, they see something they disagree with, and their response is to grow apart. Sometimes it's murder, sometimes it's merely going separate ways, sometimes it's selling a brother into slavery. To correct that, to close the gates of exile and allow us to go on the path for redemption and return, Moshe and Aaron need to see each other despite their differences. And the differences are great between the boy who grew up in the court and the boy who grew up as a slave in Egypt. The differences are unfathomable for those of us who are lucky enough to grow in prosperity and freedom. But they have to see themselves in each other, to look at each other and not see merely the differences, but also that they belong to the same godly utterance, to the same story, to the same journey, to the same song, if you wish. And then they can start us on the path to redemption. With that in mind, let us revisit the concept of baseless hatred and baseless love. Perhaps what the sages are trying to tell us is that when the Jews no longer saw themselves as belonging with one another, they no longer had the power to maintain their physical belonging to a place. They no longer had the power to fight against external threats and to live a creative, productive, impressive life in the land of Israel. If we want to resume belonging to a place, if we want to find redemption, we have to first search the place where we belong to one another, and only then pray to God to help us translate this belonging, this togetherness, into belonging and rootedness in a specific place and in a specific home of God on Temple Mount. Without this healing, without that moment when I look at you and see you as totally different from me, and yet mine, my own, and you look at me and see the same, the physical rootedness, even if we achieve it, is fragile and brittle, just as it was in the era of the judges. But if we reach it, if we're able to find it within ourselves, to look at each other and see ourselves as one, the world will open up to us. I want to finish this with one short linguistic thought and good wishes. The word ach in Hebrew, brother, is a very short word. Most words in Hebrew have 3 letters, roots, and yet the word ach has only 2 letters altogether. It almost begs to be completed. Interestingly, it can be completed in 2 obvious yet contradictory ways. One way is to take this word ach, aleph, chet, and add to it the letter resh, which will mean acher, other. The other obvious way to complete it would be to add to it the letter dalet, which will get us echad, one. When you look at your brother, when you look at your sibling, you see someone who is at once the most other and the most one. Someone who shares the most genetic material and childhood experiences with you, but also someone who, from your earliest moment, was the foil to your experience, was someone you defined yourself as not like them, as the other one from them. And what is true in the personal family, in a small personal family, is true in a nation too. When we look at each other, and we are brothers and sisters, we are achim and achayot, we can focus on what makes us acher, what makes us other to each other, or on what makes us echad, what makes us one with one another. The road to healing, the road to redemption, begins with making the second choice. And so I wish to you today and to all of us that we will be able to do that work, that emotional, difficult work of finding the oneness within our differences, like Moshe and Aaron did when they started healing the first exile in our history. And may God take our good intentions and help us and aid us in pursuing this road and closing the gates of exile and all their manifestations behind us. And may this day become a day of rejoicing in our days sooner rather than later. Be well.